Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is safe and healthy wherever they're watching from. Just to give us a feel of the audience or those who are watching today, and if you haven't yet, can you use a chat box and check in with the group? I invite you guys to tell us your name, introduce yourself, your organization, and where you're watching this session from. All right, so welcome to the Philippines Startup Week 2020 and to our session entitled Exit to Community, a New Perspective on Startup Exits. My name is Patch Dulay. I am the founder and CEO of the sparkproject.com. We're a crowdfunding website that enables creative and conscious social enterprises through learning and technology. We also work with closely with startup enablers, collaborating with them on different projects and programs. So we're really glad to be part of this year's Philippine Startup Week. In fact, we did host a session last year, the very first Philippine Startup Week. And we did a panel discussion on social and creative enterprises. And for this year, actually, we did that also with the objective that we wanted to shed more light on this sector of social enterprises here in our startup community. And also to encourage people to be creative conscious entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs who look at businesses differently, and those who are choosing a path of both purpose and profit. And this year is no different. We wanted to continue the conversation on this topic. And for this year's session, we're happy that we'll be learning more about exit to community and how this new model can help startups transition from an investor-owned entity to a community-owned one. You know, we have been familiarized with the notion that exits for startups can go either just two ways, through an IPO or an acquisition. But there is an emerging perspective proposing an alternative way for startups to exit that could potentially bring more value to a larger variety of stakeholders. So before we introduce our speaker this afternoon, allow me to thank our friends, our partners at Clock In by Ayala Land Offices. They're a co-working space that provides modern-day office and flexible workspaces, perfect for startups and businesses like yours. You can learn more about them and their co-working community and also get a free day pass by visiting their website at www.clock-in.com.ph. All right, so let's get into the session. Let me introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Our speaker for this afternoon is Carl Satinitigan. He's a friend of the Spark Project, a friend of mine, and no stranger to the startup and social enterprise community. Carl is building a portfolio of initiatives at the intersections of urban innovation, civic engagement, and food security. He previously served as director at the Office of Senator Bam Aquino at the Senate of the Philippines. And he also co-founded a social enterprise incubator and graduated with an MA in International Development and Policy from the University of Chicago as an Obama scholar. So hi, Carl, where are you? There you go.
Hi, Patch, and hi to everyone
Hey,
watching.
nice to have you join us for this session for this year's Philippine Startup Week. So how has life been for you in this new normal? This is quite different. It's not an in-person session. It's a webinar. So how has things been for you?
As far as good as a pandemic can allow, I guess. But I'm very happy
Yeah.
to be a part of this year's startup week. So last year I was abroad, so I wasn't able to fully participate. But I'm so glad that social enterprises have a space during startup week. So thank you, Patch. Thank you, Spark Project, for making sure that there's a space there for social entrepreneurs. And thanks for having me. And excited to share what I learned the past few months.
Yes, for sure. Like when I found out that you got back from your scholarship from your MA abroad, I was like, okay, we have to get in touch with Carl because I want to learn whatever it is, like all the things that you've learned back in Chicago. So just for the sake of those who are watching, Can you tell us more about your experience last year as an Obama scholar?
Sure. So I was thankful to be one of, I think we were 20 scholars in at the University of Chicago studying international development and policy at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. And really the whole goal for the entire year was to learn from public policy experts and development economists from the University of Chicago. But at the same time, connect with the Obama Foundation Network. So I'm sure you're familiar. There are social enterprises there, there are creative entrepreneurs there. And it's a huge community of people who are passionate about changing the world. And so, marami akong baon. So,
Dami ka ba?
yes. But it was a
Kulang
fun.
yata ang 1 hour sa mga baon mo. Pero yeah, for this one, we'll focus on this particular exit to community. When we were chatting before the session, we were thinking about, okay, what could we share for Philippine Startup Week? And, we thought about this particular topic, mainly because it does also, it is relevant to startups. Startups can relate to this. And it also proposes something new, something to think about. And I think that's this whole session would be about that. As he said, provocations of what could be, what opportunities are there for startups.
I agree completely. And the pandemic, in many ways, you feel like the world has shrunk a little because suddenly it's so much easier to connect with other parts of the world because you're forced to connect because you can't go outside the house. Diba? So you have webinars, you have Zoom, you have all these different online connections. And I think one of the learnings I had during the past few months was that even if the world has gone smaller, quote unquote, there's still so many things out there that we can bring here. And not to say that we are completely unaware, maybe we just don't call it the same. So it's
Mhm.
also nice to have, an awareness of the language that they use, the words, or what they call certain things, certain terms. And I think that's the goal for this session, to familiarize ourselves with what other social entrepreneurs, startups, creative entrepreneurs in other parts of the world call
Mhm.
themselves, or call what they're doing, or call
Mhm.
whatever structure they're up to, so that maybe we could take something from that, put it together, build something new, which is something we always see in your platform. So
Mhm.
I'm very excited to share that.
I totally agree. All right, so yeah, let's get into the presentation, to your talk. But before I give the floor to you, Carl, I just want to remind everyone that we will have some time to answer any of your questions. So throughout this session, you can use a chat box to ask any of your questions. Me and Carl will be there to answer as much questions as time would permit. So with that, yeah, the floor is yours, Carl, and I'm excited to learn what your baon is. All right, go ahead.
Thank you, Patch. And again, welcome to this session entitled Exit to Community. It's a new perspective, really, on startup exits. And while I was studying in Chicago, I was fortunate to have several subjects on startups, startup valuation, on different policy and development subjects. And one of the things that struck me the most was this um, th- new thing that they call an exit to community, or an E2C. And really what the whole session is about is a series of provocations for startups, for startup founders like you, or for those who are still figuring out if building a startup is for them. So first is, as the pandemic has shown, and as you all probably have witnessed the past few weeks, we've had several typhoons already. This is the normal prior to the pandemic wasn't working. And so status quo is broken. And sometimes you feel that maybe, the Philippines is just exceptionally unlucky, or maybe we're just unlucky with typhoons, for example, because we're extra vulnerable compared to the rest of the world, or maybe we're just extra unlucky with our politics, or maybe we're just extra unlucky that we're an archipelago, etc., etc. But even Pope Francis is saying that we're not it's not just the Philippines that is and our status quo is broken. The whole world is facing a lot of crises. And I'll quote from his recent encyclical, and you don't have to be Catholic to listen to Pope Francis when he says that the marketplace by itself cannot resolve every problem. However much we are asked to believe this dogma of neoliberal faith. Whatever the challenge, this impoverished and repetitive school of thought always offers the same recipes. Neoliberalism simply reproduces itself by resorting to the magic theories of spillover or trickle without using the name as the only solution to societal problems. And I like to share this part of the encyclical because I spent 11 months in the University of Chicago, what people would call the bastion of neoliberalism. Proponents of all this thinking that, trickle down economics is the way to go, and that capitalism is just making sure that stakeholders of a corporation are, constantly bombarded with growth and profit. And clearly that's not working for everybody. It's working for a very, very tiny few, but not for the rest of us. And primarily because there are a couple of reasons. And one is that, even the freest markets have their limits. So I'm sharing some microeconomics and macroeconomics discussions here from our classes. So some of you are familiar already with the work of, the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman in this amazing book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and that whole field of behavioral economics. We had a session during my time with another uh, proponent of behavioral economics thinking, Case Sunstein. And their point basically is that humans do not always behave rationally. And so, if you're a believer of the existing capitalist system, always remember that it does not factor in the fact that we do not behave rationally. Our capitalist models at the moment assume that we are rational human beings. Second is that markets price many things wrong. We don't factor in, and this is also part of behavioral economics, but also with another set of economic topics called externalities. We don't factor everything into the whatever value or price that we put on a certain product or service. And so whatever models that we build out of it is also imperfect, incorrect, incomplete. And third, finally, some things are or ought to be just beyond price, diba? I remember we had a class talking about how you value a life. How do you put a price tag on life? And then that's a whole entire discussion. But you could argue that yes, you could determine a particular price point, but fundamentally, voting or forests or public health care or preventive measures to make sure that we are future proof and typhoon proof and pandemic proof, for example, those things ought to be beyond price. And so what we're saying is because of these three things and so many more, status quo is really broken. The capitalist models that thrive at the moment don't factor all of these things perfectly. And so we have a lot of things going against us as a human race. If you need to read more about that, there are books there that I shared on the screen. And because startups, entrepreneurship is part of that whole capitalist enterprise and this whole economic platform, we could argue that there's parts of the startup ecosystem that's also broken. Entrepreneurship, as we understand it, can also be incomplete and imperfect. And one part of that is this whole notion that we always tend to favor growth. And in this startup ecosystem that we are all a part of, and I am sometimes guilty of this because I always watch out for the next big thing among unicorns, and they're not necessarily bad. But what we tend to usually see is that status quo celebrates unicorns, diba? Parang what's the billion-dollar startup out there that's the next big thing? And again, that's not to say that that's completely wrong. There's a value to having unicorns because they generate jobs, they help the rest of the ecosystem, etc., etc. But we tend to favor them so much that everyone else that's not growing as fast or that's not growing in scale, we diminish and we call them something folks call them zombies, for example. Startups that are not scaling up as fast, scaling up as much, we tend to dismiss them as zombies and celebrate the rest or those that are high trajectory as unicorns. But remember, as in what Edward Abbey once said, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. And, there's a wonderful paper called Against Scale. And one of the first provocations, I guess, that I would like to share with you this afternoon is that, yes, there's a value for scale, and we're not saying that targeting scale is bad. It's just that that shouldn't be the only way to look at startups or to imagine startups. And in fact, I'll quote from this paper: pandemics and disasters are sites of immense loss of life, property, and livelihood. We in the Philippines experience that. And they also starkly highlight what elements at the root are not working for most people and contribute to interlocking systems of inequality. While I was in the US, the whole movement of this Black Lives Matter and um, this whole movement to shake the system that is promoting inequality has, even during the pandemic, has really captured the imagination. And failures under disasters, the ones in highlight, failures under disasters are often failures of technological scale and the attendant scale thinking which undergirds them. And we hope, as with this session, that this set of provocations introduces a mode of evaluating whether systems created by designers, other tech workers, startup founders are working for those who need them most. Again, another way of saying that the status quo is broken. It's not working for the most of us. It's not working for all of us. And sadly, only a tiny, tiny few are benefiting. And so enter the zebra. So we're familiar with unicorns, a group of social entrepreneurs, impact investors, activists, even artists in the United States came together and started pushing for or promoting this notion of a zebra as compared to a unicorn. And for them, zebras are mutualistic. They run in packs, while unicorns tend to be solitary and imaginary. Zebras wear the black and white of business and purpose, similar to what the Spark project espouses. And meanwhile, their horns point at skyward profits and really really fast trajectories. And for more of that comparison, and again, this is to remind everybody, I'm not pitting unicorns versus zebras. There's a place for them both. This is a provocation to say that maybe we can expand our whole idea of a unicorn, for example, or celebrate other alternative models that also look at sustainable prosperity, for example, looking at plurality and not just monopolizing a particular market, looking at a cooperative method instead of just a purely competitive method, mutualism instead of parasitism, and having a shared participatory style instead of just hoarding significant parts of the market just to capture, a bigger market share for everybody, for most of everybody. Finally, another set of comparison. Usually, zebras would like to believe that their beneficiaries are the greater public and the communities, and not just the short-term shareholder mindset of some unicorns. And I'm not saying all unicorns. And also, they want to have a balanced composition of teams among community managers, engineers that value transparency, and that the user not just pays for example, attention, but also for value. And really pushing for regenerative growth, meaning growth that isn't just for the company itself, but for all the shareholders that are with it. And I know that sounds hard, and I know that sounds like a difficult thing to do, but zebras are out there. They are not pure imagination. So, for example, I'd like to share with you this afternoon this very interesting healthcare startup, very relevant during this pandemic as we're all facing a healthcare crisis. This startup called Savvy Cooperative or Savvy.coop. Again, relatively new, so who knows? It may, it still has a long future ahead of it. But the way they design themselves is that even users or patients in the platform are part owners of the healthcare of this healthcare platform. And so they use patient insights, they use data to generate, better healthcare solutions for the users, provide an insurance mechanism, for example, for all the participants in the platform. But the patients themselves earn a profit from the enterprise, again, because it's organized as a cooperative. And so Savvy Cooperative, and if you look up and if you read about them on their website and a couple of news items, is one example of a zebra or this whole other way of organizing a startup. Another interesting model or example of a zebra is this group called Cook Alliance, which initially started as a group of activists that wanted to support home-based cooks in California. In as a quick background, in California, you can't sell or you can't earn a profit formally if you're selling from your home. Prior to I think a few years ago, and what Cook Alliance did was organize these home cooks because some home cooks just can't afford to have their own restaurant outside their home. Either they're taking care of their family or they have a disability, for example, and so they're stuck at home. But they have this wonderful skill of cooking, and they want to earn from it, but the law does not recognize them or does not allow them to do that. And so Cook Alliance originally started out as a community organizing initiative, but now has transformed itself into a platform slash social enterprise that's supporting these home cooks. And you could visit them at cookalliance.org. Again, another example of a wonderful zebra. And so you might argue, Carl, maybe these are, zebras are new things. And maybe they're just another fad or they're just another we can't know for sure if they're a new way of doing things that will redound to something permanent or long term. But I'd like to share two big institutions that are not zebras, or they don't call themselves zebras, but we believe have the same mindset or have the same aspirations. And one example is this really famous cooperative from Spain called Mondragon. And you can, I don't want to take up most of the time explaining them, but what they're really doing is that they're organizing workers and all their employees as part of the cooperative, and delivering services not just in Spain but in multiple parts of the world through a model that is a cooperative. And in the Philippines, we know of cooperatives that have done some similar work, and this is not entirely new. But another local example that's not a cooperative that I'm a big fan of, and some of you may know, is CARD MRI, which is short for CARD Mutually Reinforcing Institutions. CARD is short for the Center for Agriculture, Research, and Development. And again, they started similar to Cook Alliance. They started out as an NGO organizing communities to have better access to livelihood programs, but now has grown into this wonderful holdings company of multiple zebras under their portfolio, and they're doing very interesting things and very innovative things that I would argue could be as innovative as a startup or as a unicorn that's out there. Things like micro insurance, for example, that is very, very hard to execute, but they've managed to do it, and they've managed to actually even scale it, which is another indicator that maybe this is going to be there for quite some time. So zebras, they may not call themselves zebras. They're not entirely new. We've seen them. And the hope is that as we grow more zebras and as we build new business models, we encounter new ways of organizing ourselves. And that's why we'd like to share with you this whole notion of an exit to community, or an E2C, exit to community. And what is it essentially? An E2C is the ability to transfer great startups to ownership by their great communities. Again, it's the ability to transfer great startups to ownership by their great communities. And again, this is primarily because many people who have called themselves, or many social entrepreneurs, impact investors, founders who have started their own businesses, they were thinking, the traditional or the common way of exiting does not really work for us. It does not appeal to us. Are there alternatives out there? And yes, there are different ways: for profit, cooperative, non-profit, trust, but they wanted to capture it in a way that will excite, a wider audience and engage maybe younger folks into the space. And that's why they're branding it this exit to community. And when they talk to investors, even investors were saying, E2Cs are exciting because status quo, or prior to the pandemic, many companies already, I'm sure you're familiar with employee stock options, right? So you're providing your employees, your workforce, some percentage of the company as ownerships, and then you align then therefore your mission with the mission of your workers. That's one part of it. But E2Cs would like to build on that and expand that even further. And so looking at the community, not just of your workers, but also of your users, for example, your customers, your suppliers, all your other shareholders that are really part of your ecosystem that you're growing as you grow. And what investors see is that there's an opportunity here to invest in companies with actually great communities, because as they have clearer alignment among their employees, their users, their workers, and other stakeholders, it just builds on this wonderful virtuous cycle of a greater community amongst them. And so a lot of investors feel that this has a lot of potential payoff with an inherent or a built-in social impact. And so, exit to community again is this new term, but could be, old ways of doing things, but putting them all together in a fashion that allows for maybe younger people or newer people in the space to consider it as an alternative to, let's say, an IPO or a merger or an acquisition down the line. One big example of an exit to community is this group called the Center for Community Ownership, also from the United States. This is their website. And what they do is they help businesses or founders organize themselves into business models that are not necessarily, for example, cooperatives or NGOs, but still have that same spirit. So, and we don't have to go into the legalities of the difference, for example, between a community-owned business or a cooperative or a social enterprise, etc., etc. Those are very different things at different places. But with the Center for Community Ownership, what they do is they help you think about ways to do exactly that. And one example that they did this is in New York, in outside the big city of New York, in this place called Saranac Lake. I don't know where that is, but somewhere in New York, a group of residents there were worried that the Walmarts of this world will eat up their local economy, and so they banded together and started what they call the Village Mercantile, villagemerc.com, and it's essentially owned. It's a community-owned business, so the investors of the business are the community members themselves, and so it's another way of organizing. Admittedly, it's not an easy way to organize because you're organizing different people with very, very different interests. But they felt that in order for them to really retain full ownership and retain this wonderful sense of community that they already have, that it was proper that they organized this particular mall, the Village Mercantile, into a community-owned business with the help of the Center for Community Ownership. Another example of another group doing this time it's a co-op, but interestingly enough, they are a skateboarding tech co-op. So skateboarders, workers who build skateboards, and the community who are fans of skateboarding. They've organized themselves. I'm not sure which part of the US this is, but if you go into skatecrack.com, they make this, they have this wonderful community of skateboarding enthusiasts, and it's 100% owned by them. So again, another example of, it doesn't have to be like this big business of a mall, for example, but even something as specific as skateboarding tech can be organized into an exit to community where the community owns the business. So that's an example. So those are two examples of exits to communities. And again, as Patch was saying earlier, these really are provocations. We know that the status quo isn't working for everybody. We know that unicorns are, work well for certain spaces, for certain verticals, but it's clearly not working for most, or if not all. It's nice that we celebrate them because building them is hard. But I think we also have to look at other ways of organizing and building other business models. And maybe a zebra is one of them. Maybe an exit to community is one of them. Locally, there's a group of social entrepreneurs, impact investors, cooperative leaders, cooperativism, community leaders, NGO leaders who have banded themselves together into a coalition called the Poverty Reduction through Social Entrepreneurship Coalition, or Present Coalition. And if you are interested in how they want to promote, other ways of organizing your business, they are currently supported by ISEA, the Institute for Social Entrepreneurship in Asia, and that's the website over there. And so, yes, some of the examples I've shared are mostly US. That's what I learned while I was in school, but only to say that, there are examples within our part of the world that is actually really, really exciting too. And the hope is that, as we're building a new normal, building a better normal that works for more people, that most or more of these things actually become mainstream. For example, a month ago, I think the long-term stock exchange, which wants to, be opposite this whole short-term thinking in investing, just opened in New York. But it took them 9 years. It was originally in the Lean Startup as a book, as an idea. But finally this year they've opened up. And so I hope that's one way of, mainstreaming these alternative models. All to say that these provocations, they start out as, weird things or unusual things or a new term for something old, or a new way of capturing a slowly bubbling up movement or idea. And so eventually the hope is that they become mainstream and they become actual things that we celebrate. And it's very similar to the Spark Project. A few years ago, I remember I would go to the website. There were very few projects to support there, but now it's growing and growing, and more people are tapping into that community and really introducing a new way of organizing capital or sourcing capital from a particular community, and in itself a new way of growing your community. And I maybe just to end, share this, I think, very relevant quote from Joel Garreau. He's a journalist and a researcher who loves to look at, trends in startups, in biotech especially. And one of his quotes that I like is this one: "If human values are going to shape our technological evolution and allow our species to prevail, we will need new rituals to mark our transcendence, to show that we're treating it seriously and taking responsibility." We always have, this ritual when we celebrate, for example, an IPO, the stock market, or it's big news. When a new unicorn comes out of this part of our region of Southeast Asia, we also celebrate, and that's good. That's really, really good. But I think we need to have other rituals as well that celebrate other parts of not just the ecosystem, but really that also reflect other ways of organizing and building business models. And hopefully, an exit to community, and as a zebra exits to its community, that is one ritual in the future we will see. That we will see founders, maybe from this session, for example, who eventually outgrow their business, want to exit, and this time turn it over to the community of users, to the community of workers, to the community of whatever other shareholders that they have, and celebrate that as well. Not consider it a zombie, or not consider it a diminished form of business model simply because they didn't grow as fast or they didn't grow in scale. So that's E2C, that's exit to community. Some of the things I learned the past few months. And again, yet another provocation during Startup Week. And I'm happy to answer any of your questions, Patch, if you have any.
Hey, Carl, thanks. I have no questions. Yeah, really, really great presentation. Actually learned a lot, and I did some notes. Actually, more of like learnings. Maybe later may lumabas na questions. But I guess just to siguro recap or maybe like share some of the things that I took away from your presentation was no, yeah, a few things. So first is like the acknowledgement that the status quo might not work for everybody. I mean, like the current status quo right now for startups, um, though mainstream or like what people or like what entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs get into, they get into this whole notion of what a startup is, and acknowledging that right now the way how startups would journey in their entrepreneurial experiences might not be always the same for everybody. And I think that's a nice point that you mentioned in your presentation, that maybe, and there are some companies that see more value, or see more value, not meaning that something that what the usual path is has less value. It's just that for them, running or building their company, there's more value in maybe engaging the community, or putting more of a premium towards social impact and all those things. And it's nice that this is something that is being talked about, and I guess that's also the purpose of this session, just to open conversation about these things, because maybe it's not just you and me. There are other people who are listening, or who are attending the session, who might have the same thoughts on how they view entrepreneurship, and they just don't have a word for it. And which comes in the term zebra that
Right.
you mentioned. Yeah, and zebra, though, yun nga with your examples also, it might be a new term, di ba? It's a new term, but the concept behind zebras naman is something new. In fact, in like with your examples, like cooperatives, in its essence, in its structure, how it's structured, it's actually a very community led and community driven type of organization. So it's just like over the years lang, co-ops, maybe here in the Philippines, diba, co-ops are stereotyped in such a way, oh, they're just for agricultural organizations, or they're just for but if you look at the structure of what a co-op could be, it actually reflects what the values of what a zebra organization would be like. So that's nice. It's like a new term, but the concept is not new. So which means it's not mythical,
Correct.
di
Correct.
ba? It's parang zebras are real, and it's possible
Yes. And
for
they're around.
those, and they're around, and it's possible for those who choose that kind of path for their businesses. And another provocation, or another point that you opened up now with, things that were popular before, and now it does take time, and it also opens up an opportunity for creativity. When we talk about many different models, different business models, what was popular or what we were attuned to before um, might not be not applicable now, but we also have to be open to new business models, updated ones, or like, yeah, and being creative in finding out business models that work, is an invitation
Right.
for startups, for startup communities, where maybe in the Philippines or in another country, diba?
I agree. And I think, sorry, just to build on that, and I remember
Mm.
what you were sharing those reflections, this whole notion also of growing in depth, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily growing in
Yeah.
scale.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And honestly, it took me a while to take, I mean, so for example, I remember very vividly in one class a few months ago, I had a class at the business school. Our professor is this long term private equity investor. And his
Mm-hmm.
idea really of a startup, and kumbaga, inherent in his definition of a startup, is 10x growth.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't deliver 10x growth, then don't consider yourself a startup. You can be a business, and that's fine. And of course, you can unpack that, and I would like to argue that there's a broader definition of startups. If you look at there's a Netflix Korean drama called Startup, and
Yeah, I'm watching that now. And then every startup episode, there's like a
yes.
VCs, and they explain what VCs are.
Correct, correct. And they have a
Anyway.
broader definition of a startup, right? Similar to the law that we were pushing for in the Senate. It's a broader definition. It's not necessarily 10x growth. And again, there's a space or there's a place for investors who look for 10x growth, and maybe that's
Mhm.
great. But what I guess what I also just want to equally emphasize is that you could also have 10x growth in terms of depth, diba? And we've
Mhm.
seen it in social enterprises, in cooperatives, where you're not expanding kunwari, your user base to thousands of people, let's say in a year, but you're transforming, let's say, less number of lives, but the fact that they are no longer as vulnerable, or they don't go back down to a place where they are so beholden to maybe a supplier, or a loan shark, for example, is
Mhm.
yet another good indicator also, diba? It's not just kumbaga the number of users that you attract. There's
Right.
also the depth of the transformation of a particular user that you're able to
Mhm.
induce by virtue of your business. And so maybe to the people listening, just a reminder that those are equally important. And in this
Mhm.
day and age, there are problems out there that require that kind of thinking, that require non-scale thinking, because as the researchers earlier, one of the researchers actually is from Google Research, which is very interesting, is saying that the that kind of thinking that undergirds a lot of the technology at the moment is very particular to very specific problems and technologies, and they've worked for the Facebooks, the fintechs maybe, but not all the other problems can be addressed that way. And so I guess if we are to grow as a community of founders, startup enthusiasts, supporters, investors, etc., is just to acknowledge that there's a role and space for different kinds of growth, for different kinds of animals. I think I shared with you. Startup in Singapore is looking for rhinoceroses, not unicorns.
Rhinos naman.
Yes, and then there was, I think you shared something about rabbits. Uh,
Rabbits.
and we could argue about the different types of animals, but just the fact that there's a variety of them, you know what I mean? That you're not only
Yeah.
celebrating the unicorns of this world, you're also celebrating other
Mhm.
kinds of
Yeah.
rituals.
Yeah, I agree. Like when you say, yeah, parang there, aside from the zebras that we were introducing today, there's a rhino and there are rabbits. And I think it just goes to show that people are also seeing that, there are different ways to describe what a successful entrepreneur is, depending on, yeah, how they see the world, right? And I think it's also, you mentioned something about investors. I think this session also isn't just for entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs, but it also opens conversation or insights that might be also useful to investors. Because also traditionally, or like typically, investors would, just like your professor, like 10x growth. But there's also a growing number of investors that are looking also for not just a return on investment, but a return on impact. And I think that's also where the depth also comes in. It's not just about scale, but also breadth, but also depth, diba?
Yeah.
So, and there are, kumbaga, if you feel like you're an investor and you feel like parang, uh, you feel like the only way to invest is to invest in a scalable startup, and you feel like if I invest in something that maybe might be closer to your what your values are, if the values are closely connected to, let's say, impact to community, you're not weird to think
Really.
that, because there
Correct.
are people who are intentionally looking for sustainable, um, could be scalable, but more than that, something that is also impact driven and something that they also measure. Um, right now, diba, in the social enterprise community, it's still pretty. A lot of conversations are happening, like how do we measure impact, how do we measure all these things. So it's still an evolution, or it's still continuous growth. Every day we learn something new about the space, and it's continuously evolving.
Correct. And the pandemic is a wonderful reminder that the least of us are, kumbaga, the least of us can have a tremendous impact on the rest of us. And if we forget them,
Mhm.
even if we're celebrating, on this side of the world, we are going to be ultimately affected. So might as well bring everyone in at diba, as much as we can.
Yeah. And I think yun, siguro ngayon, in this time of pandemic or like COVID-19 era, um, do you think, or like, what are your thoughts on this new movement? I mean, like what is their role now? Do you think that exit to communities and zebras, parang napapanahon ba siya ngayon?
I agree completely. And I think one good reason why I believe that is because many local governments, many traditional businesses have slightly reoriented themselves towards something more impactful. Originally, because they were forced to, because there was no other way, but also realizing that as they reoriented, for example, to a more local, more equitable, more social business, they realized that it's more sustainable. So, for example, we know of mayors who are now sourcing their, let's say, relief goods locally and including small scale fishers in the project, whereas before they would just source it from maybe the SMs, the pure golds of
Mhm.
the world. They can source it pala from local fishermen, and it took a pandemic for them to realize that, because there was no other choice because the SMs were closed, but also to realize that it takes a lot of work, but it can be sustainable precisely because you're building a community around it. And I think that's why I'm so excited about this whole notion of exits to communities, because you're also realigning not just your workers and not just your co-founders into this mission, but parang there's a path for your users, your suppliers, etc., to build and share that sense of community as well. Na parang the pandemic just proves that even if you're isolated in your house, you need community. I mean,
Mhm.
we are
Mhm.
social beings, and we won't survive by ourselves. So yeah, it's very timely, it's very relevant, and I hope that because the pandemic disrupted so many things, that people have more comfort in looking at these alternative models, and that we could use these terms as well. But it's the other
Yeah,
purpose of this session. Parang you have a term, you have a
there's a term
language.
for it.
Parang you're not alone, and then you can read up on other people sharing the same thing and experiencing the same thing.
Yeah. Um, allow me to just like this is very exciting. Just to balance the conversation, if like just bringing it down to reality and what we are experiencing now here in the Philippines. Um, yes, we have this zebra or the proposed let's exit to community for startups, enterprises to explore. What do you think are the challenges that we would have to face or that hinders this kind of movement to flourish in our country?
So, I mean, in my many years interacting with social entrepreneurs, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but really my hunch is it's really still very, very expensive to organize communities in the Philippines. Some people call it social preparation, some people call
Mhm.
it community organizing, some people
Mhm.
call it, development work. But it's really all about building those relationships on the ground one by one. And one reason for that is because so many of the communities and so many of our fellow citizens have been betrayed so many times, not just by politicians, but by private companies or by even by startups and social
Mhm.
entrepreneurs themselves who have
Yes.
promised, so many things. And I can sometimes be very guilty of that because I remember back in college, you'd go to a community because your subject asked you to, go into a community and talk to people, and you promise all these things, and you can't blame them if they don't trust things like
Interventions anymore.
yeah, because they've been betrayed so many times, and the poverty that we have in this country is still at a level where it's still so big, and so organizing that and reestablishing that trust is expensive, not just in terms of money, but in time, etc. And so we have to, I think that's the major challenge. It's great if, for example, government, civil society, private sector, startups, etc., have alignment on that. But even there, parang sometimes we don't really discuss how difficult that is. And parang we
Mhm.
just overlook it na parang, yeah, we should go to community. Of course they will love your product. Of course they will love your service. But knowing that that takes time, I think that's one. And so I think for me, that's one fundamental challenge that we have to
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
overcome. There are many ways to circumvent it or to fight
Mhm.
it. And one example is really this whole idea of depth, di ba? Parang you have social
Mhm.
enterprises who are really rooting themselves in the communities that they are working with, not letting them go, even if the business has gone through so much trouble, not giving up on relationships, even if some of them have there's some betrayal there or whatever. And I know of NGOs and community organizers, social workers, etc., who are doing great work in that. But that still has to, and that can be replicated in. You can see that in hospitals. You
Mhm.
could, kumbaga, that can be replicated in different verticals. It's not just, you can see that in agriculture with the farmers. You can see that in hospitals with the nurses and all the support staff that are there to build a hospital, for example. There's so much, I mean, during the pandemic, you've seen that, but there's so
Yeah.
much mistrust or parang division and konting tension lang parang, it
Mhm.
it boggles the mind how we can overcome this. You can see that in other verticals in finance, etc. And so, in short, it's a fundamental challenge that I think if we are more, I guess, comfortable in accepting that it's really a challenge and we align ourselves, uh, hopefully maybe through the present
Yeah.
coalition, for example, or all these other conversations, then maybe it's kumbaga, it's not naman impossible. It's just that it's really really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. So as a follow-up to that, so you mentioned like the realities and the challenges. What do you think, in your opinion, what things should be in place for us to be able to foster this movement? Yeah, I know you prior to your scholarship abroad, you have been embedded working with the Office of Center BAM in the government and also through other organizations and as well as with DTI, with the negotiation centers, right? So I think I just want to pick your brain on this. And if we were to promote zebras and exits to community, this alternative way of looking at business, what do you think should the move, or what moving parts should be in place for this to be able to be promoted well?
Right. There are a lot, but I mean, biased because as you
Mhm,
said, I'm from there. But I'm a firm believer that yes, you could say what you want about government, and you can say what you want about policy. It's always late, it's delayed,
mhm,
etc. But there's nothing more institutional and more long term than enshrining it in a law.
mhm,
At the end of the day, the biggest policing power in any territory is still the state, and that's the government. And so, if it's enshrined into law, into policy, that is one, I think, moving piece that should be in place. There are already elements in place. We're very excited for the implementation of the startup law. We're very excited for the negosyo centers. We've seen them even during the pandemic, reorganize themselves and deliver services. Even if they can't do it face to face, or even if you can't go to the negosyo center, there's still a lot of work to be done on that front. But at least kahit paano you have those policies in place. But there are other policies that are not yet there. So for example, for a long time we've been pushing for something like we've learned from the United Kingdom, this whole notion called social value, or a social value bill, integrating social value or impact or purpose in procurement. Government is uh, a big buyer for so many things, whether it's in your feeding program, in your relief goods, in your infrastructure, etc. They buy a lot of stuff. And so if you could just move the needle a little and inspire government agencies to, source more locally maybe, or
mhm,
source more equitably or more socially, then maybe it can ripple many
mhm.
times.
And then encourage more uh, conscious enterprises to see that this is a viable business
Yeah.
to pursue, kind of business to pursue. All right, sige. Down to my last question for you before time's almost up. But for those who are listening now or watching, what books or podcasts would you recommend for them to consume to learn more about these things?
Sure. So for specific to Exito community, the University of Colorado worked with the zebra community, if they call themselves that, and put out a manual on exits to community. So that's, you can just Google that, exit to community, usually in your lalabas. That's a wonderful book there. The other really interesting book that I learned the past few months, all the works of Mariana Mazzucato. So there's The Value of Everything, or The Entrepreneurial State. Basically, she's espousing this whole idea of um, this startup mindset and this entrepreneurship mindset, and bringing it into policy work and government work. So that's also very, very exciting. Ano pa ba? Specific to social enterprises and to um, I guess if you go to the present coalition, you could if you go to the Institute for Social Entrepreneurship in Asia, they have a lot of readings there as well that will encourage you to look at different models and different ways of organizing your business, not just as a corporation, for example. So yeah, those are some of my top of mind suggestions.
Yeah.
But
All
yeah,
right.
wala pa ako naisip ngayon.
Sige.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah. All right. So that's all the time we have for now for our Philippine Startup Week 2020 edition session for today. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in and for joining us this afternoon. We hope that you found this session uh, today or this afternoon insightful and meaningful for you. If you would like to continue, we encourage you to continue the conversation with us um, in the chat room, but also continue the conversation with us in our community, I'd like to invite you to, we'll be flashing the link to our bit.ly link. If you want a copy of the slides of Carl, we will make it available to you by signing up through this link that's flashed on the screen right now. So that's bit.ly/spark E2C. And then, let's continue the conversation there as well. We'd like to hear from you. We'd like to know what you guys think. And yeah, here, Carl, the Spark Project, we're here to support endeavors like these. And also, before we end, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Carl for sharing his time and expertise with us this afternoon. Carl, thank you so much. Um, for the organizers of Philippine Startup Week, thank you for giving us this platform to share the things that we're passionate about, and we hope that we were able to contribute to this week-long event for Philippine startups. And also thank you to our friends from Clock In by Ayala Land Offices for being our co-presenters for this learning session. So again, this has been Patch July from thesparkproject.com. Thank you again. Have a nice day and see you in our future events. Stay safe and healthy, everyone.